Hello everyone, welcome along to Live on Air for this Sunday evening, the 3rd of April 2016, and I've got with me two presenters today. We've got Julie Thompson and sitting next to me Val Nichols, but I'd like each of them to introduce themselves to you. So let's start with you, Julie. Tell us a few words about yourself.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Julie Thompson. I'm a retired primary health care nurse. That's a nurse who has worked in general practice for at least 30 years, but I'm doing a little relieving as well now as a locum. I also attend Methodist Church at Trinity at Waiaki and have done so for some time.
And I'm Val Nichols. I'm a retired presbyter from the beginning of this year, which has been really good. I've got 2 grandchildren full-time, so that keeps me busy. And I'm working on the history out at Waitoki and Kaukopakapa in my spare time.
I didn't know that, Val. That's fantastic because Val and I were colleagues both in ministry. She was in the adjacent parish to me for a very, very long time. And then we were colleagues in Trinity Theological College together. So without any further ado, I'm just going to share the questions that we're looking at this evening and over to the two of you to walk me through this.
Right, well, David, would you be able to give us an overview of Carl Gustav Jung, please?
Yeah, sure. And please feel free to interrupt me if I'm not clear at any time or you want amplification on an answer. And likewise, we've got 4 concurrent viewers presently. Anyone that's viewing is welcome to feed through their questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. So the easiest way to start with Jung is to have a think about, I think the very first thing is what kind of a person was he? And as you'll soon get to realize, we've got a whole heap of resources in an overall introduction to Carl Gustav Jung. And that introduction has 8 videos associated with it. And I've put up what I think are the key points for those videos. Let me just bring that back over to here. The introduction to Jung says that he's a Swiss psychologist, he's a medical doctor, he's a pioneer in the field of psychiatry, and he really was. Along with Sigmund Freud, Jung dominated the first 20, 30 years of the 20th century in terms of the developing field of psychoanalysis, psychiatry, etc. He was also a prolific author, as was his teacher, Sigmund Freud, and many key ideas from Freud and Jung have become part and parcel of everyday life. So that's the first thing that I'd want to say about them. And let's just see whether you've got any further questions you want to ask about Jung at this point.
Is he influenced by his family background at all?
Well, he is actually, particularly later in life, he's a very wealthy person. He married into money. His wife came from a family with a substantial fortune. And it was that enabled him to do much of his traveling around the world. And to some extent, there was, I think, a little bit of jealousy on the part of his friend, mentor, and teacher, Sigmund Freud, who didn't have access to that same wealth.
Thank you.
I was thinking about the relationship between Freud and Jung. There were some similarities, but some differences, weren't there?
Yeah, Freud dominated the field initially, but the two split apart after a time because Jung really became less enamored with Freud's ideas. That's not to say they were the only two in the field. You've also got the great Alfred Adler and numerous others that came in the 20s and 30s. but between Freud and Jung, you've got pretty well the foundation laid for an understanding of the life of the psyche.
The psyche. So what's the difference between the mythos and the logos? Because that was part of what he was on about too, wasn't it?
Well, I think the mythos and the logos is a really key point also. So let's just have a look at that. For understanding the word mythos, first of all, if you look at the bottom point that I've made there, I say on the other side, mythos is how we dwell in relation to our own inner world. It's a universal world, but it's inside of us. Our rational side is the logos, which dwells in relation to the external world. So mythos and logos. In mythos, we're telling and learning the story of ourselves in universal inner world terms. In logos, we're telling the story of ourselves in relation to the external world. Sometimes it's called the difference between the rational and the irrational. Irrational doesn't mean bad or silly or anything like that, but rather it's just the opposite of the rational world. Now, there's a very significant quote on this idea of mythos and logos. And Jung said, when a man is 50 years old, and here the word man is the generic, early 20th century. When a man is 50 years old, only one part of his being has existed for half a century. And that, if you like, is the rational logos side of it. The other part, which is also in his psyche, may be millions of years old. And so the inner world for Jung, the world of the mythos, is actually a much bigger, deeper, broader world than the world of the logos. And he came to this realization on the plains of Africa, in fact, on one of his great trips. And the quotation is there below the bit in purple. It says, there on the African plains, the cosmic meaning of consciousness became overwhelmingly clear to me. Quote, man, I, in an invisible act of creation, gives the world objective existence. Now, to me, that's quite impressive. It's really saying that as we develop and understand our inner world, we actually give meaning and structure to the outer world, not vice versa. So this distinction between mythos and logos is really quite a crucial distinction.
Does this lead us on to talking about the psyche and the soul?
Okay, I think that's an excellent point. It does lead on, but before we do that, I'm just interested from your perspective, Julie, whether you have any idea about what you think the psyche or the soul is.
I have been struggling with this. I feel it is an inner part of my being, but to grasp the real meaning is very difficult. I hope I have a soul, as I'm sure most of us do, and I guess it is linked to the psyche.
Okay, this I think is really at the kind of heart of Christian life, and Jung wrote a book about it. He called it Modern Man in Search of a Soul. And I think that title is so expressive. It's almost as if in the modern world, we've lost what it is to be a soulful human being. But though we set out in search of the soul, it doesn't necessarily explain what it is or whether it in fact exists. His title is, We Are Searching for It. So I'm just wondering from, say, Val's perspective at this point, whether you have any comments that you would want to say about what you think the soul is, because you've been dealing with this professionally as a clergy for a long time.
Yes. for me, it's the essence of who I am. And I guess the search is to know yourself, and to find that it within yourself. And I think it's a journey. But yes, I think it's real.
Do you think that the soul has a real objective existence? In other words, by objective here, what I mean is, can I look at you and say there is a soul inside of you, or can I look at Julie and say there's a soul inside of Julie, or that Julie is a soul? You see, I think this term soul is really very, very difficult to get hold of. Any comments, Julie?
I find this difficult. I am sure there is a soul in Val. To define that is very difficult. It's that very deep inner substance, something. I don't know.
No, and I appreciate the honesty of that answer. And I think that the what Jung might say here is, where we've become conditioned to thinking of, do we have it? Do we possess a soul? And Jung was quite convinced by the Judeo-Christian heritage. He just thought it was totally mistaught by the church. But he was very convinced by some of the theological arguments in that. And rather than saying we possess a soul, what Jung would say is we are souls. And this fits the Hebraic concept of the soul being somehow connected with the breath, the life, the spirit, the ruach, I think, is the Hebrew term. I may have the pronunciation wrong. It's a long time since I've done biblical Hebrew. But this concept that somehow while we are breathing living dust, then we are a living soul, rather than we have a living soul.
Or that we have to find it with.
I was going to just say, is it emanating from us?
Well, emanating would again imply that somehow it's something different from what we are. And Stuart Mannins has just sent through a very helpful question that I'll address it to myself, but it picks up exactly what your query is about, does it emanate? And Stuart's question is, what's the difference between the personality and the soul or the psyche? And on the surface, I think Stuart would like us to sort of somehow identify as if our soul was the same as our personality. But I'm going to avoid that, because I think that the Hebrew, the ruach of spirit, the nefesh, the life force, etc., is something beyond personality. And what Jung means by the psyche or the soul goes a lot deeper. Pardon me. So psyche and soul are very complex issues of identity. We're the dust that breathes. Let's stick with that. Have you got any comments you'd like to make about that, Val?
I guess for me, personality is something that's perceived by other people, whereas for me, soul is something of the essence of within, for yourself.
Soul runs deeper than my personality is. My personality, and we'll come to personality later on, but what I am is more than personality. Yeah. You got any comments on Stuart's question, Julie?
No, I'm happy with that. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll consider that question is done, Stuart. Either of you, any questions for me at this point?
Well, carrying on from personality, is that connected with archetypes? Archetypes. How do you say that?
Archetypes. Archetypes are really quite a key aspect to the whole concept of what Jung meant. And let me just bring this up on my screen for myself. The archetypes inhabit what Jung called the collective unconscious. Now, the collective unconscious is something that, and I have to put this in my own terms, it's a sort of a socio-biological phenomenon. It exists across humanity. And this is why the soul is more than the personality. We have aspects of our personality, but there is much more within us than just our personality. And the archetypes are, if you like, the universal images within that socio-biology. Now, let's take that phrase, collective unconscious. How is there a collective unconscious? Well, you've only got to look at the world of biology to realize that there are huge things that go on in the animal, bird, insect kingdoms, the kingdoms under the sea, where whole species exhibit behaviors that can't be explained as the result of simply an individual choice, e.g. the termite colonies, or the way in which a school of fish move, etc. All of these things may have miraculous explanations, and by miracle here I mean the miracle is in the explanation. They may have miraculous biological explanations, but nevertheless, the fact is that the force, the life force, is distributed across that species. And so across humanity, there is a kind of collective unconscious that is inhabited by the archetypes. Now, let me give a very straightforward answer about what's an example of an archetype. The universal mother figure. It really doesn't matter, does it? Whether you are in Indian culture, whether you're in Chinese culture, whether you're in Western culture, island culture, there will be the archetype of the mother. And we've got this commonly in language, we talk about, Mother Earth, don't we? And so the idea of nurturing, birthing, and all of those things, there is an archetype that's universally exhibited across the human species, and I think very much in most of the animal kingdom as well. So that's the idea of the archetype.
David, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Does that mean that there are innate universal behaviours that occur because of the archetype?
Well, I really like that question. I don't know whether there are innate universal behaviours generated by archetypes, but I think if you put them all together, the collective unconscious generates behaviours. So rather than there just being one specific archetype causing one specific behaviour, it's the collective as a whole that gives rise to innate behaviour.
Right.
Now, that behaviour comes out in all sorts of ways with the archetypes. It can be, in terms of the rational logos, very, very highly developed, and this is the archetype of the Christ. And I think the archetype of the Christ amongst Christians universally is perhaps the most major archetype that they have, apart from universal father, universal mother.
So what is the Christ?
Well, the Christ, this is the figure that rescues, the figure that saves, the heroic figure. Now, we've been doing a lot of work on movies and looking at archetypal images in movies. So one way in which that gets conveyed in movies is the Superman image, the Force be with you image, all of those things. They're all drawing on the idea that there is a hero figure that will rescue and save. The Christ in Christian theology is the savior figure who somehow saves the world from itself. Now, Jung, in my opinion, was quite brilliant at this point because he revitalized the whole notion of Christianity here. He said inside of us, and we come to this later on, what we have to do is start to unite some of our own actions with these universal archetypes. So I become my truest self when, in fact, I unite myself to the archetypal image of the Christ. And as I said before, Christian theology has developed this in the most rational way, the most logos kind of way. St. Paul did it with his magnificent phrase, "It's no longer I that lives, but it's the Christ that lives within me." And so Val just said right, so she is somehow saying it is the something within me that I must unite to in order to develop myself, in order to become more truly what I'm meant to be. But here's where I think the modern day movie maker doesn't always get it right. In the ancient world, these myths and logos and archetypal figures were not personal. They were impersonal. So the archetypes for Jung, when we talk about the universal mother, the universal father, they are not specifically our mother and our father, but rather they are the embodiment of what fatherhood and motherhood was meant to be.
Thank you.
Just for those, we've got 6 concurrent viewers. We're very happy to take questions and see if we can answer them. Any comments from you, Val?
I just struggled with your description of what the Christ is being saving and that sort of thing, which doesn't gel with me. For me, the Christ is more a wholeness rather than being saved from anything. So connecting that with Batman and Superman and whatever, I don't have that connection.
That's all right, because the way in which the archetype works is that it's referring to the impersonal quality, not the personal thing that we put onto it.
Okay.
So how you yourself relate to the Christ within that you must unite with will not be the same as it will for me. The objective fact is that you are doing it around that archetypal figure. Yeah.
That's fine.
So let me just bring the screen share up again. And what have we got here? Present to everyone. So in that screen share, let's just see if I can move it on. We come to the world of the shadow.
Yes.
Now,
what is the shadow, David? What does that mean?
Well, the shadow is the archetype of the opposite of the risen Christ. You could call it Satan if you were looking for a kind of easy to understand term. You know, you've got Christ within, you've got Satan within. And the archetype of our shadows, our shadow is the opposite of the archetype of the Christ. And it exists within us as a real archetype. At times we are the people that always betray the risen Christ. Yeah, I mean, that's a common theme, isn't it, in Christianity, particularly around Lent and so on. But at other times, if we're very, very honest, the things that we see wrong in others, the things that we see in our enemy, are in fact exactly the same qualities that are within us, but they're hidden from us. We don't want to consciously acknowledge them. Yeah. We're like actors in a play. We put on masks and we project a persona. You know, we project another person. I want Val and Julie to see me one particular way, so I project a persona. I may not do this consciously, but it's an adjustment mask. It's a layer, like the actors in the ancient world put the mask on so that their true self was hidden. They projected something. Now, I want to project myself, because I'm a Christian minister, I do want to project myself as somehow united to the risen Christ. I don't want to project myself as somehow united to the Satan. So that's the aspect that I keep rather hidden. Now, Rosalie Segru has come up with an interesting question. So I'm just going to come to Rosalie's question at this point. She asks, would it be right to see the historical Jesus as the example and the Christ as the power of his teaching? Wow, that's a really interesting question, Rosalie. When I say that it's really interesting, it usually means I've got to take some time to think about an answer. So I'm going to toss that to Val and Julie, first of all. Would it be right to see historical Jesus as the example and the Christ as the power of the teaching?
I'm finding it hard to separate that Christ historically and Christ as the power. I just see it as a completeness. I think I have to go to Val.
They're passing the buck, Rosalie. I guess I would see the Christ as an extension, as an understanding of the present teaching power of Jesus that carries on. That it's I wouldn't separate the two as such, but one becomes the other.
Well, I'm going to take the opposite tack. I do think that there's a very big difference between the historical Jesus and the Christ as the archetype. They're not one and the same thing. Jesus, who walked around in Galilee and Nazareth and Jerusalem, can't possibly be the same figure that's the risen Christ. Even the New Testament says there's a profound difference going on here. And so I wouldn't want to identify the Christ as the power of the teaching of Jesus, but I would certainly want to identify, Rosalie, the Christ, the risen Christ, as something transcending both the earthly life and the earthly teaching of Jesus. So the risen Christ doesn't present me with the same dilemmas in teaching that the earthly Jesus did, because quite frankly, I think Jesus got it wrong on numerous occasions in his teaching. There were plenty of times where he ought to have been more open to other points of view than he really was. Jesus, the historical figure, is a first century Palestinian peasant who acquires a rabbinical education. And as such, he's fiery, he's sharp-tempered, he says and does things that within the context of his time are perfectly understandable, within the context of a Roman authority dominating the Jewish population, perfectly understandable. But if you're saying, are those teachings always universally applicable in, say, the way that some of the Greek philosophers like Plato or Pythagoras might be more universally applicable, the answer is no. Not that I think that Plato and Pythagoras are always universally applicable either. But what I'm getting at here is the risen Christ is beyond that. The risen Christ is somehow the mediator that mediates the message of God to humanity. And that's what Jesus couldn't do. Jesus could only mediate the message of God to his local context. So I'm not sure whether I totally agree with what the distinction that you've made there, Rosalie, but I think it was an excellent question. And we're very happy to take as many questions as you want to give us. So just flicking through.
So if we go back to the shadow for a minute, so if you're saying that we put on a mask to project what we want to project, and that covers up our shadow self, so therefore the shadow could be good or bad.
Well, really, that's another excellent insight, because the shadow isn't necessarily bad within us. And Jung said the shadow is the hardest thing in the whole of his psychology or psychoanalysis or therapy to understand. The shadow is something that we have to come to acknowledge, but how we get to acknowledge it is a whole lifetime's work. And we may never come to really recognize what shadow is all about. Pardon me. Stuart Mannins has also come up with a question here. In view of your discussion of archetypes, how do you interpret the Church's statement, there be one God in three persons? Well, I'm a fan of the Trinity in some senses, but I don't think that's the right question to ask at this point, because the archetypes are not to do with church doctrine as such, and the doctrine of the Trinity is a theological logos type doctrine that is developed, whereas the archetypes are the inhabitants of this bigger inner world. It has an objective existence, but so I'm not going to answer that at this point, Stuart. If I've got time, I may come back and talk about it later in the discussion. So we've had a good go at shadow. If we move on now and ask, what about dreams? And again, the question of the archetypes comes up all the time in dream world, the dream world that is such a big part of who we are. And there are a couple of key points here, because I'm not a dream analyst, I'm not a Jungian analyst. I look at everything from the point of view of practical theology, and Jung's insights generate really exciting ways of looking at the Christian message, but they also do generate some exciting ways of looking at dreams. And so the first thing he would say in the world of dreams is distinguish between a sign and a symbol. Many things in your dreams are simply signposts that point to something else, but the symbol is the thing that points and participates. In other words, that's the archetype. Now, the archetypal figures do come up in dreams without a doubt. But in the world of dream analysts, it's very difficult to give an exact answer. Someone comes and says, oh, what's the meaning of this? Interpret this dream for me. The dream analyst, if they're a Jungian, would say, well, you must find the answer to that dream within yourself. Stick to the image that you saw in the dream, rather than have me or anyone else say, oh, this is what it means. You develop the meaning for yourself. That is how you come into conscious play with the archetypes. So stick to the image when you're talking about dreams. Now, Jung said this: the dream is a hidden door to the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul. It's an opening into the cosmic night. And he makes the distinction between what we are when we are awake and conscious, and what we are when we are unconscious and sometimes dreaming. All consciousness separates. But in dreams, we put on the likeness of that more universal, truer, more eternal man, dwelling in the darkness of the primordial night. There he is still whole, and the whole is in him, indistinguishable from nature and bare of all egohood. Now, I think that is quite fantastic. In dreams, we put on the likeness of that more universal, truer, more eternal man. So, in the world of dreams, then, we have the archetypes coming to the surface, but we ourselves are not going to have a dream every night of these great inner revelations of the unconscious, the depths of the unconscious world. Far from it. Which is one of the reasons why Jung often advised people to work mostly with the big dreams that they had when they were children, as opposed to the big dreams that they have, the dreams of the archetypes, when they're adults. And I think that what he was getting at there was that in the world of the child, we haven't tried to unite with the archetype. The archetypal figures rise up and we have little conscious understanding or control of what they are. Any comments? And then I'll give you an example.
Yeah, I find the whole dream thing really quite difficult. It's not something that I've studied or tried to interpret. So, yeah, it's a bit of a mystery for me.
Well, did you have dreams when you were a child?
As a child. Yes, I can remember a couple that I had.
They're quite vivid. These are vivid dreams that you had.
Yes.
Yeah, and were they recurrent?
One was.
There we go. That if you're working with a dream,
Yeah.
that's the one that I would go to. And as I said before, you can't get, if you went to a very skilled dream analyst, they would guide you to some extent, but they would still say you must find the meaning for yourself. Yeah. Julie, what about you? Do you dream?
Yes, I dream every night, but I don't write down the dreams because so far I'm not sure that I want to explore those dreams, but this could change. I did have dreams as a child and I can remember vivid dreams. I wondered if they were to do with fevers, looking back, whether it was something that we did when we had these vivid dreams when we were ill. But I do remember some.
Well, I think vivid dreams are really quite critical to being able to come to the path of what Jung later on calls individuation, which is what we'll explore as the last question in the series. Elizabeth Davies has come up with a question that I think we have answered when we said what's the difference between the sign and the symbol. And I'll just repeat my answer to that because it does come up in the dream world as well. Elizabeth, the sign is like a signpost. You've got a street sign that points to somewhere. But the symbol is like a sign that also participates in what it's pointing to. And in that sense, it becomes a much greater thing than a symbol. Than a signpost. So the symbol is greater than the sign. Now let's look at that in terms of, I don't believe in sharing in dreams, particularly big dreams, but I took the risk, the gamble of putting one into the series, the micro-mooc that we have on an introduction to Carl Gustav Jung. And this was a recurrent dream that I had as a child and into early adulthood. And I think maybe once or twice, as a more mature adult. And the dream basically consisted of being chased by a bear at the bottom of the garden and having to escape up a ladder. And this dream came back night after night, week after week, I won't say year after year, but it did return year after year, but the sequence of the fright, it was a nightmare. It grew less and less in intensity. But clearly it was one of those big dreams of childhood. If you were a Freudian, you might want to interpret that from some kind of sexual basis, coming to sexual awareness, because the bear could conceivably stand as a sort of the male dominant figure. There's a whole heap of ways of looking at it from a Freudian point of view, but I prefer, I may be wrong, but I prefer to look at it from a Jungian point of view, that this dream was trying to tell me something about the nature of ego, and all the elements of this are how effectively, as a child becomes a man, will they handle the transition of childish ego to a more mature understanding of ego, and the kinds of things that trap us when we're doing that. So from a Freudian perspective, this was a dream about repressed sexuality or repressed sexual desire. From a Jungian point of view, the conclusion that I reached was that it was more to do with the notion of who I am. And there are lots of really great symbols in there. The symbol of the bear is not a signpost here, Elizabeth. The bear is a very present, terrifying reality that chases me. You could say that something is forcing me from a transition from childhood into early adulthood. The ladder going up and down, you know, from which I escaped from the familiar garden into something which was a bit more of a jungle, that is the ladder not to heaven, but the ladder into a terrifying and new world in which I had to make my way. So the big dream for me there was really important, and I give quite a detailed understanding of that back in the actual notes to the video. So big dreams are really important because they take us into the world of the collective unconscious. They bring us face to face with archetypal figures, and they have a capacity to teach us something, because the dream is the right royal road into the collective unconscious. Is that fairly well?
Thank you.
Okay, and if I haven't been clear, anyone in the audience is welcome to come back into that. Now, I'll just move us over then to
personality types.
Yeah. Well,
so what are these, David?
Well, let me ask you that question. Val, you've used personality type tests, haven't you?
Yeah.
What do you understand by a personality test? What does it do?
I remember the first one I ever took myself, and it made me very cross that a personality test could tell me who I am. It was fairly accurate, and I think that made me even madder to think that it was something that could be universally used. And I mean, there's variations, and there's things that are right and things that don't relate. But yeah, I found it quite difficult and quite revealing.
Okay, you probably did what's called the Myers-Briggs test. Yeah. Now, Myers and Briggs, the mother and daughter, they developed that, I think, in the 60s, and they actually introduced something new. At the time, Jung said, oh, it's great that people are doing this development. He knew that would happen, but his understanding of personality was essentially a little bit different. So the personality test that's used almost by every big business corporation, they use it sometimes to take people into theological training, they certainly use social work, you know, all of that. they will have the different functions of the personality. The most basic function is introversion versus extroversion. Now, Julie, would you describe yourself as an introvert or an extrovert?
Oh, introvert, David.
Introvert. Well, that means that you tend to prefer a smaller rather than a larger.
Yes, I like small groups, small dinner parties. I'm shy, inward, definitely introverted.
Okay, what about you, Val? Are you the extrovert or the introvert?
No, I'm the introvert.
Oh, you're the introvert?
Yes.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'm actually introverted as well, but because I regard the function of ministry as something where you actually have to be a bit of an extrovert, I overcame introversion to project in my persona. Most people would say I'm extroverted. I'm not. I'm strongly introverted. Yeah. So those were actually Jung regarded that as the foundation of personality, whether you were introverted or extroverted. He also said there's a basic distinction between a thinking type and a feeling type. The thinking type is not necessarily more intelligent than the feeling type, though thinking types do tend to think that they're more intelligent, and that gets right up the nose of the feeling types. Thinking means that they prefer that rational logos way of doing things, whereas the feeling type will go into a situation, into a room, into a dinner party, whatever, and they will try to understand how people are feeling in the group. Yeah, they do display more empathy. And then for Jung, the last pair was sensing and intuiting. Now, the sensate type is the person that lives in the now, in the moment, whereas the intuiting type lives in the future. Now, I can't remember the statistics, but the population is quite skewed in this. Thinking types are about 20% of the population at large. 80% tend to use feeling as the majority function. And in terms of the sensate and intuitive, again, there's a majority of people who live in the now, as opposed to thinking about what are the consequences of the future. Now, from a practical theological perspective, nothing has intrigued me more over a lifetime of ministry than to see how this plays out when people get into the pulpit and preach. Because if you put a thinking introvert into the pulpit, the chances of them successfully connecting with the majority of their congregation, who will be feeling types and sensates, is actually, well, there are limited opportunities for engagement. So the divide between the pulpit and the pew becomes really quite apparent around the personalities that come into a congregation. But of course that applies to the workplace situation as well. So if a person was really strongly a sensate, that they really did live in the now, and I would be doing a sermon that was sort of saying, well, now this is a possibility and that's a possibility and you have to consider this, the sensate cannot cope with that. And they get angry and they sometimes walk out, as I've said on previous occasions. They sometimes explode into a rage because they're not capable, because of the way that their personality operates, they're not capable of entering the world of the thinking type, of the intuitive types. So those were the basic personality functions as Carl Jung saw them. But he did, Myers-Briggs came along and they introduced what they called perceiving and judging as a function. And I'm not convinced that that actually is a real function of the personality, but that's a totally separate argument altogether. The vast majority of companies, businesses, many institutions use the Myers-Briggs as a way of breaking the ice in terms of understanding how people get together, grow and develop in their team situations.
And if there's other evaluations going on as well, it's part of the tools.
Yeah, you would have used that a lot with ministry students.
Yes,
Yeah.
With other things. Where does the big picture person and the nuts and bolts person fit? Where does that fit? Because I'm a nuts and bolts person and you'd be the big picture.
Well, that's a question I can't really answer, because it seems to me that a nuts and bolts type person could actually be anywhere on in those.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think of the nuts and bolts as opposed to the big picture. Might be more about how effectively we're understanding the archetypes inside of us. Are we connecting with the more universal figures? So nuts and bolts is actually quite a comforting thing. Some people, they get a detail that enables them to do their job well. So big picture people may get bored by that. I see these as different functions from the personality type per se. Yeah. Julie, have you got any comments, or do our viewers have any comments on this?
Just briefly, I'd like to say I find this Jungian personality types very helpful in understanding myself and other people that I'm with. In relationships.
Yeah, how relationships work. Yeah, okay, very good. So let's move ourselves on to the last point, because we're at 7:51. We've gone well and truly over time, and we come to healing and individuation. And I think this is the key from a practical theologian's point of view. We have to unite the polar opposites of our personality function and orientation. We have to bring balance to life itself. So what I mean by that is quite simply that if we are, say, a sensate who's also a thinker, a sensate thinker, then the opposite side of their personality in the second half of life needs somehow to be more developed as well. We have to somehow work at uniting what are the opposite sides of our personality and slowly bring them into a greater degree of balance, so that we're not strongly extroverted, not strongly introverted, but all the time trying to bring together. Now, the key to this is around possibly the greatest, one of the greatest of the archetypal concepts, the animus and the anima. Now, animus is best described as the essential maleness function, the anima as the essential femaleness function. And as a male, I don't have to worry about my animus, but I do have to worry about the anima, the feminine side, the feminine qualities that actually would make up a whole person. And likewise for Val or for Julie, in the second half of their life, pardon me, they too must work on their animus, the things that the maleness aspect of their female personality. So anima and animus are key driving factors in the second half of life, and by individuation, Jung meant slowly we bring anima and animus, thinking and feeling, intuition and sensation, introversion and extroversion. They all start to become not one dominating hugely against the other, but they start to be more in balance. And this is the path to healing. We've heard the phrase midlife crisis. Jung didn't quite introduce that term, but he certainly brought about the whole way of thinking. The second half of life, he said, no one ever came to him without in some way recovering their basic religious feelings that they had lost, that they had initially as a child. And again, it's that actual balancing of the forces. So a very good example of animus and anima, Christianity itself was a religion of the animus, for all that rational logos type development for century upon century. In fact, we've got the patristic period where it's the church fathers that develop this highly rational, highly thinking way of organizing the religion. And inevitably, said Jung, there would come a reaction, and it comes, Stuart, this is where it's not the Trinity, but it's a related issue. It's how do you bring the feminine side into the equation? And so gradually you see the Mary, the mother of Jesus, becomes an almost equal and important feature of Christian life in Roman Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity, in order to balance up that maleness, that animus that had been so strongly developed. And Jung thought that when the Roman Catholic Church made the doctrine of the Annunciation of Mary, you know, they elevated Mary to the status of someone as if they were within the Trinity. You know, the Mother of God must be an equal somehow up there with all those other three in the Trinity. Jung saw that as a necessary counterforce to what was a very one-sided, male-dominated religion.
But it remained male-dominated.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the tragedy of Catholicism that it can't escape its dogma at all. And though Protestantism has become a spent force in the world, particularly in the Western world, it won't be long before in Asia and Africa Protestantism also becomes a spent force. Catholicism and the Eastern Orthodox traditions will survive much longer, but they will not communicate with the West at all. Any comments? Any questions?
Well, thank you, David. I think that we have covered a lot of ground tonight and certainly increased our understanding of Jung. And it appears to me we need to understand these concepts for balance to make us more whole people.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, thank you for asking the questions. I'd like to thank Val for coming down from Whangaparoa to sit with me, and Julie also for coming in. And just a reminder that in Kiwi Connection, there is a micro-mooc called Introduction to Carl Jung. The PDF that I publish from tonight's discussion will have links that take you directly in there. People that have difficulty navigating around Kiwi Connection, it's actually very easy to navigate, but these PDFs actually function like little apps and they get you into all parts and questions of the site, and it's one easily locatable thing that you can download, keep on your computer, just click the links and you'll end up in the public pages of Kiwi Connection. So thank you to both, and we'll say good night.
Good to be here.